Project-based learning is kind of a buzzword. You'll see it on the internet in a number of contexts, often sort of education corporations talk about project-based learning. I'm going to tell you a sort of formal definition of it, but also then give you more informal ways to think about it. So first of all, the idea behind project-based learning is that having a project as an end goal gives some kind of material or, gives material that you're teaching some kind of additional relevance beyond the pure theoretical or intellectual inquiry. So you could say that something has personal meaning to you or that it has real world meaning to you. It gives some kind of specific context to attach the assigned reading and writing to. It's supposed to deepen the engagement students have with the assigned reading by adding to the rationale for attending it. So we're not just reading Thucydides because he's historically important. We're reading him because he helps us think about something else. I have some caveats behind these basic ideas. And one thing is just that I don't love the idea that you have to have some other reason to read something other than this is a good piece of literature, or this is enjoyable, this is an important work. I think in some ways, some texts you just want to teach because you want to teach them. But for things that you're not entirely sure about and don't really know exactly how to organize your in-class behavior and your out-of-class assignments, project-based learning can actually be really useful. So for me, my main goal tends to be, how can I use my in-room time meaningfully? And often, because I'm teaching historical works of art and literature, how can I make them interesting in the current moment and important in the future? Not just talking about what context produce these works, but maybe why they're valuable to us now. Even if they don't seem valuable, how can they become a tool for thinking? It's also a way for me to sort of offset my own authority, let students kind of learn from each other. There's always some high-performing students that just sort of take the lead in these circumstances. And sometimes it's helpful for quieter students to watch them work. And then sometimes, you know, whether students themselves want to participate, they're still taking a lot in. So I think learning from each other is always useful. And just gives me some time to sort of sit back and watch. I also like these kinds of assignments because it allows me to think creatively, and I get to play with fiction and nonfiction. So I'm not a creative writer, but I like making up scenarios. So flash fiction in my own pedagogy. It's also a way to connect approaches and modes of thinking in humanities and social science fields. So one thing that project-based learning allows me to do as a humanities scholar is to say, sure, this is a pretty work of art, but what's its social impact? And political scientists, sociologists, economists, all the professors in those other departments have given me ways of thinking about my text so that I can use both. It's also a way to generate context for reading and writing in different genres and for understanding stylistic and structural conventions for those genres. And this, of course, links it to a number of the objectives in TEKS. Understanding genres of writing is really a big part of understanding how to write yourself. I went through the TEKS for language arts, and I sort of extracted some of the things that were sort of obvious in what I do. But the more I started to find connections between the TEKS and my own stuff, what I realized is a lot of what you see here is going to match any college humanities general education requirement. So there's not anything in those objectives that isn't also being done at the college level. You'll see again resonance here in the examples I'll give you. So I have three examples that I'll share with you. The first is an entire writing course, and this is related to what Amy mentioned. I wrote a sort of anti-textbook for first-year writing. One of the things that happens in college first-year writing classes is there tends to be a set curriculum, and it's often based around, 4 papers, right? 4 papers. This one should do this one should do that, this one does another thing, and this one does a different thing. I started to feel like that was too artificial, and so what I started to think about is, I don't know, just write a paper that has some research in it, some evidence, and makes as many different kinds of claims as you want to make about your topic, which is a big ask of first-year students who I know that you guys also have this thing where students are like, how many words, how many paragraphs, right? They want structure. And so I sort of worked along with that need for structure, but also tried to say, real writing with substance takes as long as you have, and you may have constraints and parameters where you can't just dump 50 pages on somebody, but you really do. If you want to make a good substantive case for something, you need to sort of take those parameters into consideration, but you also need to figure out what you want to say first, then worry about length, then worry about structure, so those kinds of things. I started to think it doesn't help students to write 4 different papers in some ways. I wanted them to sort of build over the course of the semester. So my writing with substance first-year writing class had a scaffolding of 11 reading and writing assignments. I called them reading and writing assignments specifically because I wanted to emphasize the interconnectedness of reading and writing, that these are not separate activities, that one fuels the other and goes back in turn and informs how you do the other one. Over 15 weeks, they would do 11 of these assignments. 8 of them were low stakes and informal. So one might be, read this essay. Ta-Nehisi Coates, for instance, wrote a narrative bibliography of one of his articles, where he basically said, okay, there's my article over here. Over here is all the books that I read before I was able to write that article. And here's how they informed my thinking. So that narrative biography is something that I said, okay, read that. Or narrative bibliography, read that. And then from there, take the books that he mentions, see if our library has them. So it became a library exercise. Very simple, right? Do what you have to do to read the thing, and then figure out whether we own these books at our library. That also sets them up for doing the same thing later. Read a bunch of stuff, write about what you're learning from that bunch of stuff, so that later you can write a paper from that stuff. So all of this was scaffolding leading up to something. They didn't get graded on those 1 through 8. They basically, if they did them, they got credit. And I noticed, like Amy mentioned this as well. That eases your load if you're not grading their every move, but it also still gives them practice. Then the last 3 assignments in the class were higher stakes, and they all had a research component. They all had a local importance component where they had to tie stuff that they've been talking about in reading to their specific environment on our campus. And then they're loosely based around rhetorical stasis theory, which is something that we talked about at UT Austin in our writing program. The gist of it is just that there are modes of addressing a topic. First, you have to establish the existence of something. Then you have to define what it is, how it fits within categories of things. Then you have to evaluate the thing, including, what's good or bad about it. Then you might propose a solution to those problems. So in my class, I always use microbeads as an example. What are microbeads? People didn't used to know what those were. That suddenly they started talking about them in advertising. It turns out they're little plastic things that have something in them that a shampoo company touts as a good thing. What are they? What are they made of? That's establishing the existence, establishing by definition. Then evaluating them. Well, it turns out they have some negative impact on the environment. So maybe microbeads are bad. According to advertising, microbeads are good. So evaluation, and then proposing. What can we do about microbeads? At our campus specifically, well, you're not gonna make a company stop using microbeads in its shampoos. But what you might be able to do is say, Hofstra when it supplies soaps and other things for its restrooms and other things, it should not use products that have microbeads in them. So there's a way in which the Stacys are always at work in the class, but I'm not necessarily having students write an argument at each of the Stacys. They might choose one of the things as the most important thing. Maybe it's the most important thing to write an evaluation right now, but I want them to use all the Stacys at some point. The ultimate assignment was one that I shared with you, which was write a paper of substance about anything. But they had to make use of the Stacys. They had to build on writing strategies that they saw modeled. Now, that's a pretty wide open assignment, especially for first year students. And that's where the project-based learning comes in. I'll also say the narrative bibliography that I mentioned before that they did from Ta-Nehisi Coates, they read his early on in assignment 2 or something. Their assignment 9 was to do their own narrative bibliography for their own topics. So basically just read stuff, do some research, write up what you found and why any of that changed the way you think. The Coterminus assignment, which I see I spelled incorrectly on the slide, nice. The project-based learning assignment is 9 3/4, which was at the time a silly Harry Potter joke. But the idea was that they couldn't do the ultimate assignment on their own well without sort of figuring out how it worked in a lower stakes situation. And that's where I would give them an opportunity to do the same thing, but with friends and classmates. And on a topic where they've already been reading and talking about the material so that they had a base from which to start writing. So the assignment 9 3/4 was something we did in class while they would work on their assignment 10 outside of class as their own individual thing. And this is the way I've come to think about project-based learning. Project-based learning is the way I deal with in class so that what they do out of class has some kind of grounding. Grounding in a sort of, I don't want to say safer environment, but an environment where they have collaborators so that they can work together on something first or at the same time, and then go do their own thing with the idea that what they did together is going to be a nice bridge or a set of stairs so that they can really achieve something on their own. The Coterminus assignment, they had to work on one of 2 topics of things that we had been reading about all semester. So again, they already had sort of a lot of foundation to talk about these 2 topics. They were the use of student data in universities and the adjunctification of university education so that more and more their professors are not full-time employees. And these are things that we had read about here and there already. They had a personal stake in it. I was one of few full-time faculty teaching writing studies or writing one. And everybody uses a Blackboard or Google as a technology that's very helpful, but at the same time raises all kinds of privacy issues. So those were their 2 topics. I basically allowed them, and I did this 2 different semesters. I asked them which topic they preferred. And in both times, they sorted themselves basically half and half. So I had half the class work on one thing together, half the class work on the other thing. And you have those assignments so you can see the specific parameters. But basically, the papers that they wrote for the Coterminus assignment were extremely long. So they got practice producing something very, very substantial. And messier than it would be if they wrote a paper on their own, but in a way that was completely pedagogically useful. So it allowed me to give feedback on this group paper, and it also then allowed them to see what a major study would look like before they tried to write their own. So the assignments 1 through 8 built the foundation for those last 3 assignments. In my classroom, basically the last several weeks, the students were just working on those papers. They worked on the paper together. They could divide up the work, you know, and there are always students who don't want to be part of it or don't try that hard. And you can see in the rubric and the description of 9 3/4 how I tried to handle that. So I won't go into the assignments that specifically, but again, inside the classroom, they're working on this thing together. Outside of the classroom, they're taking what they did in the classroom and then sort of figuring, well, okay, so what am I going to do when I do my own? Okay, so that was, I just divided my whole class. I organized the entire class around this kind of project-based learning so that when they were working on the project together, they would be ready to write the sort of pinnacle assignment. So the 3 high-stakes assignment really were the way that the class built up to. You can't always do that, and I can't always do that. I can't always design my class that specifically. But for my honors college teaching, often when I'm presented with a text that I just kind of don't know exactly what to do with immediately, I'll figure out a project for students to do that, again, will do this kind of same thing where it gives me something to do in the room that will then help them write what I'm asking them to write outside the room. Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, I don't want to, you know, teach this to you, but just to give you a sense of what it is, if you've never heard of it, it is a book that is obviously, it's about a war, and there's a long series of passages that describe the plague of Athens. The plague of Athens is so awful and the descriptions are so vivid and colorful, but then they're followed by this part where Pericles gets up and he starts to say, you know, the plague was bad and all, but we should go back to war. So let's go back in. And then a series of statesmen give a bunch of long speeches saying whether or not that's a good idea. So they're basically arguing for or against invading another place. Now, when I was reading this, I thought, ugh, gosh, these guys are all so awful. And, you know, you can't teach that. That's not really pedagogically sound to come in and be like, aren't these people annoying? So the thing that I kind of started thinking is, well, gosh, you know, people in our government make arguments for and against doing acts of war all the time, you know, so how can I make this interesting in the room, because I'm not a classicist. I'm not an expert on Thucydides, Pericles, the war, anything, ancient Greece, know very little. So first I had to figure out what's my reading objective. My reading objective is that students have to understand these characters' arguments for and against, and the rationale by which they're making those arguments. That seemed an easy enough pedagogical goal and an important one that didn't require me to really know anything about ancient Greece. My reading objective 2, students should recognize that all these speeches that they give have particular rhetorical emphases, that they have distinct speaking styles, and those styles are kind of fun to look at. You know, this one uses flowery language, this one uses very abrasive kinds of language. So there are ways in which, again, I could engage with the text as a reader that didn't require subject area expertise. So that's the basic thing from reading. How I wanted them to write, well, I came up with 2 writing assignments. One was a 2 to 3 page rhetorical analysis of a speech, so these speeches work. And another one was a 4 to 5 page argumentative paper, who makes the best case and why do you think so? Either of those assignments work fine. I had 2 opportunities to teach this text. I use one in one case, one in another case. And it really depends on how much time, you know, I was given to teach this. So that's what students were going to be doing on their own. Rather than sort of talk them through the assignment specifically in class, I wanted to do something different. So what I did, and this was a lot of prep up front, but then it was very easy during the week and a half that we studied this text. I also put this assignment on the Google Doc. Basically, I decided to have them take a character for or against war. I gave them a specific character, and I make a connection between what that character was arguing in Thucydides to arguments that people were making about invading Iraq in 2003. Now, again, this is a sort of political example in a way, but in some ways for them, it was not, in that most of them weren't born at the time a lot of this stuff was happening. Most of them have not had an opportunity to think about it in any specific terms. And part of the way that it worked for me is not only were they unfamiliar with some of these arguments, but I gave them characters and I gave them sort of dossiers that told them the argument that they were supposed to mirror, because these characters in the text already have pro or con arguments. So for my purposes, it wasn't, what do you think about the Iraq War? Was that a bad idea? Was that a good idea? It wasn't about their political positions. It was about positions that already exist in the characters in the fictional text, and arguments that already happened historically. So first they had to figure out how the speaker would give a speech. And they were given these sort of commands as if they were staffers working on the campaign of these particular Greek speakers. And so you can see in the assignments themselves, it sort of gives them this made up scenario. I'm a senator, I have the plague, but while I'm out, come up with an argument about the war based on what you think I would say. How do you know what I'd say? Well, read the text that you've already been assigned, look and figure out what kinds of things I might say about the Peloponnesian War, and then, switch the invasion area. So they would have to figure out what the stylistic features of the speech are. And then they would have to figure out what the salient arguments are. And then the harder part, how do you apply this to a completely different historical context? Well, at that point, I gave them what I called a little dossier, and I had news articles that were specifically chosen to match the talking points they were given. They were all things I found from 2003 to 2005. They were all very old, and they were from various sources, so run the gamut. And this way they got to look at the news, they got to look at opinion pieces, and then they also got to connect Thucydides' very, very old text to something that was also to them kind of old, but not that old. So that's generally how that assignment worked. Here's what I think worked, or what I wanted to have happen that did. First of all, it made the exercise of reading the text much more social. Secondly, it allowed us to see that persuasive writing and speech have an actual social and civic purpose in the world. And just by being able to talk about what those arguments were, there was a little bit of a democratic process happening in my classroom, where students would really work together and try to figure out how to address the group project. It also helped connect the ancient text to more recent history. And rather than, give them or impose a political position, it emphasizes, just by virtue of what the text was and the additional text I provided, that there were a lot of different viewpoints in circulation, that it wasn't just an obvious answer, do this, go in or not go in, but that it was very complicated, both militarily speaking and politically speaking. So this is kind of a difficult thing for students to do, to make these connections in the time that we had. I had less than 2 weeks, but they did a good job, and they had what I could tell was actually a really good time. It allowed them to be creative, and I think that's part of why they enjoyed it. But also it's a doubly contrived circumstance. That is, it's fictional in Thucydides, it's fictional in my scenario where they have to serve these senators or Greek speakers. So there's no way where they could say, you're grading me based on my opinion on warfare. So it's all sort of set for them. And the rhetorical exercise is embodying a position that's just given to you. How does that work? And there are, of course, ways to be resistant within that. And some of them were very smartly, but it helped me not have a sort of set or allow them to say, well, this is what I really think. But they could do that in their individual assignment if they felt like that was the best way to address that assignment. It also allowed them to kind of practice the rhetorical flourishes. So speak like somebody who does not speak like you. The more you try to emulate somebody else's writing style, the more comfortable you feel with slightly more sophisticated diction and more sophisticated rhetorical figures. So all of that stuff happened. My second example is, oh, sorry, I had one more thing that I was going to tell you about this, which is, and this is the big thing, it gives students additional insight into the text that we were reading. It gives them a sense that they have social importance, not just in their own time, but outside of their own time. And the main thing is that the group work they did and the work they do at home is mutually informative. So I think it added intellectual depth and more careful attention to the text because they were really busy doing that stuff together before they had to take it on their own. My second example is we had to teach Gordon Matta Clark, an artist that I'd never heard of. Gordon Matta Clark is an artist. He has a background in French literature and modernist architecture, but he ended up being somebody who's a little bit more of an activist. He called himself an anarchitect. His work was part of these big land art movements. So lots of artists were doing giant pieces that worked with the environment. His worked not with the natural environment, but with man-made built stuff. So any kind of architecture that exists. He was also an activist, and one of his artworks was to run a not-for-profit restaurant in Soho called Food. And so a lot of the things he did are ephemeral and hard to say, like, that's a work of art. But some of the things he did, you'll see on the slide. Once he basically split a house in half, and another time he cut a chunk out of a wall. So splitting in Day's End. A lot of his art is available not as a piece that you look at, but as a video you can watch on YouTube, where he just destroys stuff. Or he'll cut a chunk out of a linoleum floor and then put the linoleum chunk and say, that's the artwork. And so he called what he did anarchitecture, and it was a way of drawing attention to social issues, issues like gentrification, which was even a problem even in the 70s, and other kinds of economic disparities that he was calling attention. But you can also see in the bottom work that there's something really fascinating about dark and light and the way that nature and man-made structures work together to create aesthetic shapes. So there is a lot to talk about. I know very little about Gordon Matta Clark. I know very little about New York in the 70s. And even though I live in New York, I don't have any personal attachment to this person. So in order to figure out what to do, again, I turned to project-based learning. I wanted students to be familiar with Matta Clark's visual styles and goals, not so that later they could talk about him at a cocktail party and, you know, exercise social capital, but again, as somebody to think with and through. They might want to know some of the historical and legal context behind Matta Clark's work, and some of that information was supplied by the secondary reading they did and a lecture by a colleague. That was what I had to work with. I had an individual writing assignment where I asked them to write a descriptive essay on one work by Matta Clark. What does it look or sound like? What are the effects? And then I had an individual writing assignment where they had to debate the merits or limitations of anarchitecture. So a lot of the social impact of it can't be said to be permanent or lasting if part of the work is an act of destruction. So I wanted them to think about that. What's good about this kind of art? Is it really effective at doing anything? Especially, you know, if he was very important to lots of people in New York, but many, many people don't know who he is or have any way to engage with his work. And some of it, you know, my students were like, that should be just called garbage. So in order to get them to think a little bit more substantively, that's the individual kind of work I wanted them to do. And again, in class had group projects, project-based learning, to ensure that they were able to apply this to a specific circumstance. So I asked them to think of campus spaces that present a problem or opportunity for either new architecture or anarchitecture. So here too, I gave them a choice. Do you want to think from a sort of professional or classical trained person, or do you want to think about personal and civic experience and be an architect? And then I presented them with a fictional scenario where they were asked to either address student groups on campus for addressing this campus space issue, or administrators. And I gave them in the assignment sheet itself sort of a way to think about their group's ethos, whether they're architects or architects, a series of quotes, a series of pictures for them to think, okay, this is who we are. Now let's think about who we're addressing with our proposal, and then make a proposal for how to fix it or deal with it. Again, the objectives are to think more deeply about the texts that we're looking at, how people operate within space. I think looking at a video of Matta Clark cutting a house is a little bit alienating, especially if it's black and white and from the 70s. But you know, what is it, if you could chop a building in half, which one would it be and why? And what would that make you think about or do? It also was helpful to think about why the aesthetics of architecture are important, whether they're just decorative or whether they actually have function. We could think about this 1970s New York in relation to our 20th century or 21st century campus. And then again, the creative, doubly contrived situation where they're not only dealing with works of art, but also a fictional scenario where they can inhabit different kinds of thinking. And they aren't graded on their political positions or whether they think architecture is superior to anarchitecture or whatever. They're just being asked to think in a certain way for this period of time. And here too, there was a component where they had to think about addressing an audience. In the two cases that I gave them, their audiences were different. How do you talk to students? How do you talk to administrators? Here too, the goal was to allow them to have some kind of insight for their final, for the writing they would do on their own on Gordon Matta Clark, so that some of what they were thinking was really informed by each other and by this opportunity to test out ideas with other people. Now, in terms of how to grade this stuff, you'll notice almost all of the things that I talked about with project-based learning in my own use, they're all group projects. I tend not to do project-based learning for individuals. In the case of my whole class, project-based learning, you can see exactly how those assignments are graded if you go to those links and look at the rubric, and it's actually laid out how I do the grading for that. With the small unit group projects, the Thucydides and Matta Clark and a whole bunch of other things that I've done along the same lines, is that the in-class group project is always low stakes, where basically they get credit for showing up and talking. And I do think that even students who don't participate vocally are taking stuff in. Does that mean they may not be working as hard as some other students? Possibly. So the onus to contribute is on each student in those cases. I try to emphasize that the engagement is its own reward and that it will manifest in the work that they turn in for me individually that is graded. Sometimes that's not enough. And so there are other ways to hold them accountable for the small group projects. First of all, you can do semi-formal presentations. So my students gave their Thucydides speeches. And there's a small element of public shaming, you know, for the presentation where you want to have somebody stand up and represent your group and represent them well and make it look like you did a good job. So presentations of the groups. There's also a way to add a meta writing component so that in the individual assignment, sometimes I've had them write a couple paragraphs at the end where they talk about the relationship between what they've done on their own and what they did in their groups. Sometimes they say things like, well, what we did in our groups, we were mostly joking around, right? But then you could see sometimes with even the joking around, it's like, but when you were joking about that, that was a little bit of an incisive commentary that then wove its way into your paper. So doing a meta writing component that is not graded, but also asks them to reflect, also makes those ties between the project and the individual work a little more concrete.